Stanford University.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming out on this beautiful Sunday afternoon. I've been at Stanford for 4 years now, and I realized as I was walking from the parking lot, this is the first time I've been here on a Sunday. And it's wonderful. It's so quiet and peaceful, and I think I'm going to be coming back more Sundays. But I thought I would maybe talk a bit about storytelling in Chechnya, some of the stories that were both behind the book, some of the stories from Chechen history, some of the stories from Chechnya Today, how I came to write the book, and maybe end with a story of meeting somebody that inspired the book after the fact. So chances are, if we've heard of Chechnya in recent years, it's been in relation to something terrible, right? The stories coming out of Chechnya are never good news. Maybe we remember the bombings in the lead up to the Winter Olympics recently. Maybe the Boston Marathon bombing. Chances are there's a bombing in any headline that Chechnya appears in. And this question of what is this violence about really goes back about 4 centuries to when Ivan the Terrible, who was famous for killing his own son, not a paradigm of good parenting. He expanded the Russian Empire to include the Northern Caucasus in Russia's territorial holdings. And this question over who has legitimate sovereignty over this region has been the basis of the Russian-Chechen conflict. One of the most fascinating periods, and where a lot of the folklore that undergirds the contemporary fight in Chechnya comes from the 19th century, when a man named Imam Shamil led 2,000 to 3,000 warriors against a 1 million-man Russian army. And he had this idea. He wanted to create this trans-Caucasian caliphate. And we only need to look at today's newspaper to see how this might have contemporary resonance. And he was this incredibly brutal, but very clever man. He would put the horseshoes on his horses backwards, so that if Russian soldiers came across the tracks, they would all follow him in the wrong direction. And he was sort of famous for these incredibly daring escapes. There'd be these stories of Imam Shamil on the mountaintop with, surrounded by 300 Russians, and he'd hold them off single-handedly with his saber, and then jump off a cliff and do a backflip and land in a horse, land in the saddle and gallop off into the sunset. And he lived this life that fascinated the great Russian writers of his era. Tolstoy, Lermontov, Pushkin all traveled to Chechnya and all wrote about this man because he was this sort of larger-than-life figure. His firstborn son, when he was 8 years old, was kidnapped by Russian soldiers. And the son was brought to St. Petersburg, where he grew up in the Tsar's palace. And he ended up becoming this foster child of the Tsar. Pretty soon the son forgot his native language. He became completely Russified. He began to believe that if only his father, Imam Shamil, back in Chechnya, could see how wonderful Russian art and science was, this whole war would be over. And along the way, he fell in love with a Georgian princess. We know this isn't going to end well anytime a Georgian princess is involved. And meanwhile, back in Chechnya, back in Dagestan, Imam Shamil went around trying to kidnap members of the Russian aristocracy, looking for somebody of a high enough social standing that he could trade hostages with the Tsar for his son. And he did it for about 20 years. And the Tsar had really grown to see Imam Shamil's son as his own flesh and blood. And the Tsar was unwilling to trade hostages. So all these poor Russian aristocrats were meeting unfortunate ends at the hands of Imam Shamil. Eventually, however, Imam Shamil kidnapped this Georgian princess that the son was in love with. And so the son goes to the Tsar in Petersburg and says, can I can I trade places with her? She's the woman I love. And the Tsar thinks about it and says, if this is what you really want, fine. And by this point, Imam Shamil's son was fighting in the Russian army, the very army that was waging this war against his father back in Chechnya. And so they do this prisoner exchange on a field in Georgia. And Imam Shamil's son walked south, and the Georgian princess walked north, and they passed each other on this field, and that was the last they ever saw of each other. Imam Shamil's son died a few years later in a land he no longer remembered, surrounded by family whose language he could no longer speak, and the Georgian princess went off and married someone else. And a few years after, it was the son's sort of prediction that his father would fall in love with Russian art and science was proved correct. Imam Shamil surrendered, and rather than imprison him or execute him, the Tsar, who still had these very fond feelings for Imam Shamil's son, instead installed him in a dacha in Western Russia. And Imam Shamil and the Tsar became pen pals. They would write these very affectionate letters back and forth, sort of saying, who could remember who started this whole war? The Tsar would send Imam Shamil china, and gilded little decorative boxes, and Imam Shamil just thought it was wonderful. And that's usually the part of the story that they leave out when they're telling it in Chechnya today. But this sort of larger than life, these larger than life figures populate Chechen history, and it's something that carries over to the contemporary period. The leader of the Chechen insurgency for the entire period in which the novel was set was a man named Shamil Bayev, and he was named at birth after Imam Shamil. And as he grew to prominence within the insurgency, he tried to style himself after his namesake to become this sort of legendary jihadi warrior. We see the role of storytellings of stories throughout the recent conflict. There's one anecdote which always sort of amazes me. A reporter from the LA Times was in Chechnya, and he was there illegally. Journalists weren't allowed in at that period. And a group of Russian contract soldiers captured him, and they were going to execute him. They thought he was a spy from the CIA. They thought he was abetting the rebels, and they were going to kill him. And these contract soldiers tried to style themselves after Rambo. They would wear the red bandanas, and they'd have the bandoliers and the sleeveless shirts. And if you look at photographs from the period, they all sort of looked like Rambo. And so this journalist from the LA Times thought that his only way of saving himself was to tell a story. And so he started telling these contract soldiers that he had interviewed Sylvester Stallone a number of times in LA. And he never had, of course. And he started making up all of these stories about Sylvester Stallone's personal life and all of the crazy things that Sylvester Stallone would get up to. And he was just like Rambo in real life. He always wore the bandana, and he'd drive around LA shooting bad guys. And the contract soldiers were just enthralled. They thought this was the most incredible thing ever. And so they kept him up all night to hear these stories, and then they sent him on his way with a bottle of vodka the next morning, and he lived to tell the tale. And I sort of got a sideways glimpse into the sort of the way that reality can be fictionalized in a place where history is subject to the whims of power, where life is just a grand narrative in which characters can be written in or out, where dialogue can be inserted into the mouths of people who never spoke. I had the opportunity to visit Chechnya while in between my first and second year here at Stanford, and beforehand I consulted various people at Stanford who had sort of gone to troubled areas of the world and tried to get some advice. And the first thing they all said was make sure that no one knows you're an American. And so okay, I can do that. You want to blend in. And so I tried to grow a beard, and that was not successful. And I tried to find a way to get to Chechnya. How do you get to a place that's largely been known as being this sort of desolate war zone? I ended up finding the first Chechen tour guide on Twitter, and in Russian, her website was very elegant, and this isn't a part of the world known for the elegance of their websites. And when I put it through Google Translate, it became a website that was selling knockoff prescription drugs. So I arrived to Grozny after some negotiating the travel arrangements. Not entirely sure who was going to pick me up, if there would be a couple crates of Lipitor in the trunk. This young woman named Elena was wonderful, and she took me all around Chechnya, and I spent a couple weeks there. But I was trying to keep a low profile. But Americans are a rare species in Chechnya, and word got around quickly that there was this American in town. And the head of Grozny TV, the local news station, summoned me to his office, and it was a very hot July day. I got there, and he said, "I'd like to offer you something." And I thought, "Oh, great! I'm thirsty. An iced tea would be great." And he said, "No, a reality television program." And he went on to describe this reality show that was going to star me and my best friend Musa, a Chechen journalist who I'd never met before. And in sort of elaborate detail, he described how Musa was going to take the flight back to America with me and would move into my apartment, and we'd film this sort of program about our lives together. And it was all predicated on the idea that Musa and I had been friends for ages, and we'd be road tripping around America, and we'd send all the footage back, and they'd couple it together into this program. And at one point, I pointed out that I'd never met Musa. We weren't really friends, and that was sort of entirely beside the point. That if a person in power, if the head of Grozny TV says that you're friends, you're friends. And sadly, it did not work out. And I, to this day, I've never met Musa. But whenever I hear a knock on the door unexpectedly, I go downstairs imagining what I'd say to my best friend for the first time if Musa was on the other side with a camcorder and suitcase. But this idea of storytelling being as corrosive as it can be redemptive is one that's true, and that you see repeatedly throughout recent Chechen history. One of the instances when stories sort of really did save a life, I would say, was an instance in a town of northern Chechnya called Starogladovskaya. Tolstoy had lived in this town in the 1850s. He had accrued a series of gambling debts in Moscow, and he decided, rather than pay them, he would flee to Chechnya because surely his creditors wouldn't follow him there. And he joined up with his brother, who was in this army that was fighting Imam Shamil. And he lived in this town for 3 years, and it's where he began writing his very first novel, Childhood. And he returns to this area 50 years later for his final book, Haji Murad. And so a museum dedicated to Tolstoy has been built in this town, and it was the only museum to stay open in both the First and Second Chechen Wars. And it was able to do so because its curator would sit at the front door with a shotgun, and he would ward off any non-Tolstoy enthusiasts. And so I arrived thinking, I wanted to see this museum. I'd read about it and read about this really fascinating man, and I expected that there must be a stack of Tolstoy's correspondences or a feathered quill that he had used, something to justify the enormous risk that this man had put both himself and his family in by keeping a museum open in the midst of a war. And so I arrived, and he took me into the first room, and there was nothing there. He took me into the second room, and there was nothing there either. The third room, nothing there. There was nothing in the museum. It was an empty house. But rather than showing anything, he simply told stories about Tolstoy's life, about Tolstoy's novels, about how Tolstoy helped him align his moral compass in this era where it had been recalibrated to point to survival rather than to rightness. About how Tolstoy's works had taught him about love, about how to grieve, about how to die honorably. And it quickly became clear that this museum that had nothing that Tolstoy ever actually touched, that was on a plot of land Tolstoy never actually stepped on, had become this sanctuary for Tolstoy's work, for these stories, and that by creating this space where these stories were told, were preserved, this curator was allowed to, or was able to create for himself a kind of sanctuary for something that he treasured and that he valued deeply, and that was preserved in this period of time where virtually everything was being destroyed. And those were the kinds of characters, the kinds of people that I was most interested in writing about when I started working on this novel. Most of what we read in the news about Chechnya, about Syria, about Iraq, it tends to be about the extremists. It tends to be about field commanders and generals and presidents and diplomats. It's rarely about the common civilian, the everyday person, the people who make up the bulk majority of the population in these areas. And so while it's set against the backdrop of this war, it's not really a war novel. It's about surgeons rather than soldiers. It's about teachers and neighbors and historians who are sort of caught in the gears of a history that they had no real say in. Those were really the figures I was most interested in. I think that that the job of a novel sometimes is to be a basin that sits under the history books and catches the people that fall through the cracks of our histories. But why on earth would a young man of Italian and Irish stock write a book about Chechnya? Good question. Thanks for asking. I have no biographical connection to this region. I have no family stories that were told to me as a child. It began when I was my interest in the region began when I was in college. I went to USC in Los Angeles, and I wanted to sort of go to the opposite side of the world. Those of you who have lived in LA surely can recognize that sentiment. So I thought St. Petersburg would be a good choice, about as far around the globe as you can go before you start coming back around. And I'd always loved Russian novels, the scale, the scope, the moral intensity of them. Reading War and Peace or Anna Karenina, whether or not you like the book or not, becomes a milestone in your reading life. And so I decided I was going to go to Russia. But in order to go to Russia, you needed 4 semesters of college language Russian. And I had none. But I figured, how hard is it really to learn Russian? Pretty hard, it turns out, pretty hard. So I took some poetic license on my application and ended up in St. Petersburg. In my junior year, I was 22 at the time, or maybe just turned 23. And that was where I began to hear about Chechnya. This was a couple of months after the Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who did a lot of reporting from Chechnya, and she's written several books. If anybody's interested in reading more about the region, she's definitely the person to turn to. She was assassinated, presumably for the work that she had done from there. I arrived, and I was living with a family that spoke no English, and at the time, I couldn't speak any Russian. And it was a mother and her 2 grown sons. And her 2 sons smoked quite a lot. And they were only allowed to, the mother sort of had this rule that they could smoke in the house, but they could only smoke in the bathroom. And so they turned this bathroom into a smoking lounge. It was not a large bathroom, but they had a little television in there, and they had a chair that fit on top of the toilet. And it sort of looked like an out-of-date disco. And they were loath to give up the smoking room for, its the purposes for which it was intended. So I spent most of my time in St. Petersburg, one of the most beautiful cities on earth, searching for a restroom. So I ended up walking around the city quite a lot, every day, every few hours, really. And in my wanderings, I would often cross paths with this group of Russian military cadets. They were 16, 17 years old, and they went to school at this cadet academy down the street from us. And they would march up and down the block in military formation. They would be wearing these beautiful blue, powder blue uniforms. They had peaked caps. Not a hair was out of place. And as they would walk around, they would sometimes pass the Chernyshevskaya metro station. This was the metro station right by our apartment. And this metro station during rush hour became a gathering point for men who also wore military uniforms, though theirs weren't nearly as well pressed, not nearly so maintained. Some of their trouser legs had been hemmed because they had lost their legs. And these were Russian veterans of the Chechen Wars. And they came there at rush hour to solicit spare change from commuters. And you would see every now and then these military cadets walking by and passing these veterans who were just a few years older than them. And for a moment, it felt intensely poignant, this sort of sight of these 16 and 17-year-old kids looking at these destitute veterans and sort of peering into their future. And these veterans looking back at these younger versions of themselves in some cases with uncertainty and pity. And it just seemed like one of these rare instances where the past and the future were sort of looking each other directly in the eye. And that image just sort of stayed with me. And I wondered, what was it that separated these two groups of people besides a few feet of asphalt and a couple of years? And the answer was, of course, Chechnya. And so I started reading about it, really, with no intention to ever write anything. At the time, it was, for me, as it is for most Americans, Chechnya was vaguely synonymous with far-flung terror and poverty, and that was it, really. It had no meaning beyond that for me. And so I started to read whatever I could. various historical accounts, nonfiction, the reportage that's come out of this recent conflict. And the more I read, the more fascinated I was by its culture and history, the more moved I was by the story of the civilian populations. Chechnya is only about the size of Connecticut, only has about 1 million people. And yet it's repeatedly over the years punched far above its weight in terms of how it's affected the Russian body politic and Russian culture. Solzhenitsyn wrote in the Gulag Archipelago that the Chechens were the only ethnicity that the Gulag guards would give a bit of free rein to, because all of the guards were terrified of the Chechens. This is a place where in World War II, its entire population was deported to Kazakhstan and Siberia and Kyrgyzstan and remained there for over a decade, and came back to a region that had been repopulated with Russians to find that their graveyards, their cemeteries, the tombstones had all been uprooted and had been demolished to make paving stones. And yet, despite all of that, when the time came following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, they again tried to fight for independence. And there was something, just incredibly powerful about all of that. And so at one point I tried to find a novel that was set in Chechnya. I think that a good novel is a tunnel that can take you straight through the center of the earth, and you emerge on the other side next to people you never otherwise meet. And I was really surprised that there had been no novels either translated into English or originally written in English that were set in Chechnya over the last several decades. And so I came to write the book more as a reader than a writer. This was the kind of novel I wanted to read, that I wanted to pick up on the shelves of the Stanford Library. Only it wasn't there yet. So I wrote it. As I was writing, I had a lot of difficulty sort of figuring out how I was going to tell this story. How do you go about writing a novel? And so rather than think of it as a 120,000 word novel, I tried to think about it as 120,000 word increments, because 1,000 words was about what I could do in a day. And I kept myself to this rather strict schedule. I would try to write 1,000 words a day, and I kept this word count log on the wall behind my desk. And on the days when I got 1,000 words, I'd mark it down in black ink. If it was under 1,000, I'd mark it in red ink. And I grew up in a very Catholic family, so shame has always been a large part of my experience. And I was finally able to leverage it and put it to use in this case. But maybe I'll end with this story about one of the people who I relied on in terms of researching the novel. There was a memoir written by a man named Hassan Bayev, and he was a surgeon in Chechnya. He went to medical school in Siberia in the 80s, and he didn't have enough money to both pay for his tuition and pay for a place to live. So he lived in the train station while he was in medical school, until somebody at the school realized that he was this really world-class wrestler, and they popped him on the wrestling team and gave him an apartment. And after he graduated, he came back to Chechnya, and he got into plastic surgery. He thought that was sort of the most profitable surgical field he could go into. And at the beginning of the Chechen Wars, he found himself the only person in this village, this town of 60,000 who had any sort of surgical experience. So he began to teach himself trauma surgery using very sort of medieval implements. There wasn't not a lot of advanced medical technology that was able to seep through these closed borders. And in his memoir, he writes about this experience, and towards the end of it, he writes about his nephew, a man named Ali Tepserkayev. And Ali Ali was sort of his second hand in the operating theater. But additionally, Ali and his brother, and Ali's brother, would smuggle out tapes, video tapes to Reuters. And for a period in 1999, sort of anything that we ever saw in the evening news came from Ali and his brother. They would take camcorder cassettes and they would stuff them in cigarette packs, and they would then conceal those on these microbuses that would go over to Ingushetia. And over there, somebody from Reuters would take them out and would provide them to various news services. And so, of course, the Russian security forces wanted to get their hands on Ali and his brother, and eventually they did. They kidnapped, abducted Ali, and they put him in a place that the landfill was based on. And he was put in a pit, and he was tortured. He was later shot alongside his brother, and his brother died, but Ali lived. And Ali ended up escaping to Moscow using a dead man's passport. And that's sort of where the story ends in this man Hassan's memoir. So I was, in June, I was in Nantucket, and I was doing a reading, and afterwards a woman with a Russian accent came up. And she said that she'd been reading the book in her book club. And she said that in the author's note there was something very lovely that I'd said about her uncle-in-law. And I asked who that was, and she said, Hassan Bayev. And I asked who she was married to, and she said, Ali Tepserkayev. And she invited me over to her house that evening. And for a writer, there's nothing quite as terrifying as meeting somebody who could have walked out of your book, as meeting somebody who your book, who had inspired your book. Because if you haven't done their experience justice, then the whole thing is a shamble. So I went over to their house that evening, and Ali met me at the door. He's about 6'4". He's a black belt in about a dozen different martial arts, and he just gave me this huge bear hug, and we talked for hours, and he was telling me about his life today. He had, after moving to Moscow, where his uncle's memoir leaves him, he had come to America and had gotten political refugee status and had been living on Nantucket, of all places, for 10 years. And he has a Russian wife and a young daughter, and they own a house. And he is this sort of master carpenter. He builds houses. He came from part of the world where every house had been demolished, and now he's in Nantucket spending his life building houses. And it was sort of, throughout the book, there are sort of these happy endings projected into the future, where minor characters sort of get a little grace note, decades down the line. And meeting Ali and seeing his family and seeing this small parcel of happiness that he'd been delivered was for me sort of seeing that projected future earned out. So I'd be happy to take any questions if you have any. Yeah.
In the book, there was this part where you talk about the Sufi, the Sunni. Is it the Wajahadin?
Mm-hmm.
So what are the Wajahadin?
The Wahhabi.
Okay.
Yeah. The question was about the various strands of Islam that have come into Chechnya in recent years. Traditionally, Chechnya has been Sufi, so think whirling dervishes rather than bearded clerics. The Chechens were the last ethnicity in the Northern Caucasus to convert to Islam, and they've always practiced this sort of mystical Sufi form. The traditional sort of spiritual ceremony in Chechnya is the zikr, which is this dancing sort of communal prayer which is incredibly beautiful. And when I was there and I saw people do it, it's almost like hearing a Gregorian chant. Sort of everybody takes a different part, and it becomes this really extraordinary musical piece. However, in the 90s, the first Chechen War was really an independence movement, but there was very little support from the wider world that the Chechens were able to rely on at the time. One of the only the only country in the world that recognized them diplomatically was Afghanistan. And the leaders, both the military and political elite, quickly realized that by tapping into this wider global movement of jihad, they would be able to take this localized conflict and turn it into something much more. And so they ended up getting support from Arab charities, from the Mujahideen who had fought the Soviets in Afghanistan, and by sort of tapping into this growing reservoir of extremism, they were able to make this cause a much broader one. And so today, quite sadly, the Wahhabism, the sort of very doctrinaire, conservative, fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran has really sort of seeped into the culture at large. So even though the Russians have more or less have more or less won the war, to put it sort of simplistically. Even though the president is a Chechen warlord and rebel who's gone over to the Russian side, Chechnya Today is more conservative and is more influenced by a more fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran than it was 20 years ago. That the regime presently has realized that by sort of leaning towards the very doctrine of their enemies, they're able to take away one of the galvanizing recruitment arguments that the insurgents make, which is that the government in Chechnya puts Russian law above the law of God. So for instance, 20 years ago, if you were a woman, you wouldn't have to wear a headscarf in school. Today you do. If you want to go to the movies, you have to wear a headscarf. And this is particularly troubling because, it's obviously troubling, but it becomes even thornier because you now have a number of refugees who are moving back to Chechnya over the last decade. So people who grew up in Norway, people who grew up in Europe and in Russia, who have had access to a much broader sort of vision of the world than they would have had they grown up in Chechnya, who are now coming back to a place that is even more conservative in many regards, which I think is creating some tensions that will could lead to trouble down the line.
Let's start back here. I don't think I need the mic. You talked about an opportunity for a happy ending, and although the book's ending is not happy per se, there's certainly elements of hope amid all this tragedy and brutality. And I wondered how purposeful that was on your part to want to have that element of hope in the end, or if that's sort of where the story went.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that in a novel, you need to. I felt an obligation that if I was going to take the reader through these various circles of the inferno, that there had to be some line of hope that would bring you along. I felt like sort of morally obligated to do that, partially because I think that all of the characters in the novel, as was the case with many people in Chechnya at the time, were doing really extraordinary acts of personal sacrifice, of courage, who would risk themselves for others, And so I sort of saw Hava, the young girl in the novel, as embodying that, and for her to have met a different fate would, I think, have just sort of crushed everything. would have just sort of spoiled what the book was working towards. And since so much of the book is about these very difficult decisions that these people make, these sort of leaps into the future and these sort of points where the light leaks in a bit, became these moments where I wanted to show how the decisions that these characters made weren't in vain, and that they did have ramifications, and they did bear fruit, even if it took years to achieve.
Well, excuse me, I wondered if you did learn to speak Chechen, and if you actually went to, for instance, that little village in the mountains. Did you go there?
The village in the mountains was in the novel was fictitious. I did go to a village right at the Dagestan border, which was called Benoy, and it was one of the rebel strongholds throughout the wars. And I was there as the guest of an imam, and sort of as the guest of an imam, you're untouchable, basically. But even so, he wanted to keep his eye on me, and he went to the mosque for his afternoon prayer, and he said, you can't come in here, you're not a Muslim, but you need to stand right here by the door. And I said, oh, okay, well, and I started to wander off to take pictures, and he chased after me. He was this a very sweet man, very short, and sort of pumpkin-like, and he chased after me and was angry, and said, you have to wait right here by the door. And I asked why, and he said, so I can hear you scream if the wolves take you off. So I put the camera away and I waited right by the door. But no, I didn't learn to speak Chechen. In Grozny, Russian is the lingua franca. And so my tour guide, for instance, who had grown up in Moscow, her parents had, decided to get them out of Chechnya as soon as possible when the violence began. And she was only now taking Chechen lessons. So we would pass, every now and then you would pass a sign that was in Chechen, and I would ask her what it meant, and she wouldn't know. But as soon as you get into the mountains, this village, for instance, everyone was speaking Chechen.
Is this a novel of historical fiction, or is it all historical?
It's funny. The tag historical fiction is one that I think has been applied to it now and then. But I began working on the book 4 years after it's set. I began in 2008, and so it doesn't feel like it's the distant past. Everything in the novel, I believe, is plausible, even if it didn't actually happen. I think that's sort of the bar that fiction needs to clear. That most fiction is about things that didn't actually happen in precisely that order, but it has to have been possible for it to have had happened.
So you really have a responsibility, because you might be one of the very few people that have written in that light. Mm-hmm. And for that one person, that family, and to be so grateful that you had talked about them and you said something about the integrity of giving it in the novel, so you were accepted. Whereas if you had done fiction with it, played fiction with those characters, that isn't good for them. I mean, you have a big responsibility with this, because it's not just happening in Chechnya, but it's groups and clusters of all that territory that Russia wants back.
Mm-hmm.
So you really do have a power, and you say that the book is written in how many languages?
I think it's been translated to 15.
And you made that possible?
I only speaking. I mean, I didn't do the translating.
But I mean, you were guided to the people to how to do that.
Yeah, my publisher sort of took care of that. But I mean, you make a good point in that anytime you're writing about a group of people who have been historically marginalized and misrepresented, you certainly have a responsibility to them to try to portray them honestly, and that's what I tried to do.
The good thing you said to me was that you tried to take the storyline of the people that you met and you became ingratiated with to a point at the end of that story that there was hope. Mm-hmm. And you might have designed that around all the environment that you were in, not creating more to make it more exciting as a book that might sell better.
I mean, I think that that the Chechnya at that time didn't really need much embellishment. That it was plenty. There was plenty going on there. Any other questions?
What are you working on now?
I recently finished up a short story collection, which is set over the same time period and involves the Chechen Wars, but from the Russian perspective. I sort of wanted to sort of see things from the other side, and I'm just starting a new novel, which is set somewhere much warmer and more pleasant to take my girlfriend on a research trip to.
I'm sorry, where?
It's still sort of under wraps, but somewhere warmer and more peaceful.
So my book club read this book about a year ago, and all of us gave it a unanimous thumbs up. And what we liked best was how it reads like poetry. So I wanted to congratulate you on that and to say that it's really a very beautiful book. But could you tell us a little bit about how you came up with the title?
Oh, thank you so much. The title actually is from a medical dictionary. I was reading the medical dictionary on likely a beautiful Sunday afternoon like this. My mom wonders why I can't sustain a relationship. And I came across the definition of life, and there's about a dozen different entries, and maybe the fourth or fifth one down was a constellation of vital phenomenon, and the six phenomena were organization, irritability, adaptation, growth, movement, and reproduction. And I remember just thinking that was such an odd and strangely beautiful definition for life. That idea that life isn't a single thing, but is rather this sort of convergence of various forces. And it stayed with me for a long time. And at some point I realized that as life is structured as the constellation of these six individual phenomena, the novel is structured as a constellation of six main characters. And after I saw that sort of connection, I just thought it was just a beautiful way of describing the book, particularly given that it's set in a hospital, and so much of it is about the different ways we try to preserve and save life.
Hi, my face-to-face book group just discussed your book, and there is so much of almost overwhelming sadness and horror that the characters confront. But I wanted to tell you, as you are continuing to travel around and publicize your book, I hope, we read the section where Sonia's talking to the black marketer who's so grateful to her about whether something is a reptile or what. And we read it with just people saying Sonia as dialogue as if it was a play. And it's hilarious. It's just hilarious. And it's a very welcome moment of comic relief in your book. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I felt it was really important as there's this exchange where one character is convinced that turtles are the product of crabs being bred with lizards, and Sonia, the doctor, is trying to correct his sort of his misapprehension of evolutionary theory, I think. But yeah, I felt like humor was essential. That I tried to sort of counterbalance every sorrow and every bit of grimness with humor and hope. And even if it sort of tilts to one side, I felt like it was really important to have that counterweight there. Not only because, as a reader myself, I think that if a book doesn't make me laugh, at least once, then it just doesn't feel true. That life is funny, even in the most absurd of circumstances. And the journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, if you read her stories from Chechnya, they're horrifying, but they're also, many of them are darkly funny. That this Chechnya wasn't Afghanistan. People weren't living in stone huts. This was a relatively prosperous area in the Soviet Union, and the citizenry was reasonably well educated, and so going from sort of a normal, stable civilization to nothing, to 1945 Berlin, just ruins. People were able to see across this sort of tremendous gap between the world as they knew it and the world that they were living in. And I think that the bridges that they tried to build across came from humor. And when I was traveling there, people had really sharp senses of humor, and it was often directed at the one thing you were most afraid of. Almost this sense of it's better to laugh rather than cry. That a joke can be a deeply serious thing. And so I was afraid of being kidnapped. And so people, I remember somebody told me as we were driving somewhere, you can sit in the front seat on the way there, but you'll be in the trunk on the way back. And I think that there is sort of a moral weight to even to silly jokes when they're done in sort of the service of maintaining our sanity. That life is tough enough already without sort of the leavening that humor provides.
I wanted to thank you for writing, a docudrama or sort of a historical dramatization, because so often when you just read news accounts or dry history books, you're sort of removed, you read these awful things, so many bodies, and it doesn't feel like it. And when you write a book like yours, you actually feel like you understand a little more, and also of what caused the thing, instead of thinking like, who are these crazy people off on the other side of the world, and why are they killing themselves? But I wanted to ask you, is the character where Ahmed paints the portraits of the dead people and hangs them around the village, did anything like that actually happen in?
That was
poetic license?
That was poetic license, but real instances of sort of the act of creation being used to counterbalance despair did happen. When I traveled there, I met a man named Adam Satuyev, who lived in this village, this town called Uras Martan, and his childhood village in the mountains had been destroyed. And so rather than sort of giving into despair, rather than joining his neighbors who were in the mountains fighting the Russians, he would go to the mountains and he would quarry stone. And he ended up building a replica of his destroyed childhood village in this lot that extended from his backyard. And he ended up building, about a dozen multi-story stone watchtowers all by himself. He built a series of houses based on those that he lived in, or those that populated his village. He built this stable, and I remember he took me to this, and he looked at it and he said, "That's where I was born." He dug a series of irrigation canals, and I remember he took me to this rock, and he'd been doing this, he's still doing it, and he's been doing it for 20 years since the war began in '94. And he took me to this rock, and he said, it took me 10 years to find this rock because it had to have the perfect divot so that it would match this rock, this boulder from his recollection. And nobody lives there. It's this empty series of buildings, this empty sort of village that's peopled only by his ghosts. And yet you get the sense that by creating this replica of his village, he was able to preserve something decent, some place for either his memories to live in, for him to travel through. And while everything was being destroyed, little Adam Satuyev there was, building this kingdom from his past.
We have time for one more question, which we have over here.
You had mentioned your visit to the Tolstoy Museum, such as it was, and the book starts with a quotation from Tolstoy. Could you comment?
Yeah, it's Sonia has the habit of reading the very last line of a book first. And so I decided that I would start the book by quoting the very last line of Haji Murad, which was Tolstoy's final book. And it's one that is sort of brought up a number of times throughout the novel. Ahmed is trying to get her to read it. He thinks it's the best book that's been written about Chechnya. And I was really surprised when I was traveling there that if you were to ask the average person who their favorite writer was, 9 times out of 10 it would be Tolstoy. And given that so much of the Chechen identity has been built on a aversion to all things Russian, the idea that the quintessential Russian novelist would be the most popular in Chechnya seems as a bit of a logical sort of incongruity. And the reason that a number of people said when I asked them was that Tolstoy wrote about Chechens honestly, and that he was one of the few Russian writers who did that. I tried to bring that sense of that Tolstoy, does masterfully of sort of removing any sort of authorial judgment. So even when I was writing a character like Ramzan, who in other books might have been this villain, I tried to write him in such a way that he would be understandable and empathetic, even as he did things that were quite terrible. And sort of stripping away any sort of authorial judgment was something that I tried to keep at the top of my mind at all times, and that was that's something that I think Tolstoy is a master of. Thank you so much for coming out today.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.